week 2 of WWE Monday Night Raw on Netflix in the Netflix era. And was week 2 better than week 1? Well, let's break it down a little bit and talk about it. And in my eyes, I think it was. And yes, you can't beat the pomp and circumstance that was week 1 of Monday Night Raw on Netflix last week in Inglewood, California. But this week felt a lot more like Monday Night Raw. Whether you knew the results or not, I could just tell people that if you tuned in this week, this is what you'd expect. This is what Monday Night Raw feels like every single week. This is what Monday Night Raw will feel like most likely going forward. It felt like a really good episode of Monday Night Raw for sure. But as for the structure of the show and the presentation of the show, it wasn't like week 1. Week 1 was presented like WrestleMania. Week 1 was presented like a Saturday night's main event. Like it wasn't on Netflix. Like this was on NBC in prime time for the world to watch, right? And we've seen that before, and we talked about it last week on the podcast, that it had more of a presentation to non-wrestling fans kind of thing, right? We had The Rock, we had The Undertaker, we had Hulk Hogan, we had Roman Reigns, we had the celebrities always being pointed out in the crowd, right? We had the arena itself, which was on display, the Intuit Dome in Inglewood, California. So this week we returned back to tradition. We returned back to the old boring stage of Monday Night Raw and the beaded curtain behind with the lights and the traditional size crowd of around 13,000, but clearly not a completely sold out arena at the SAP Center in San Jose, California. We returned right back to having, segments at the beginning of the show, and not segments by The Rock or Triple H, but just segments, right? With CM Punk and Seth Rollins and Drew McIntyre all declaring themselves for the Royal Rumble upcoming. So a traditional spot there. But then we move on to the first match of the night, and it was, as Michael Cole said, the worst kept secret in WWE as Penta made his debut against Chad Gable in what was a slow starting match, but when things picked up, ended up being a really good match and ended up being Penta winning his debut in the WWE in pretty exciting fashion. It looked like he had his friends and his family sitting ringside. He gave a little promo both in Spanish and in English to say how happy he was to be in the WWE. And, I think that was definitely one of the highlights of the night. Penta, he looked great. He's a character that is a luchador, and we've seen that before with Rey Mysterio and Sin Cara and others. But he does have a little bit more of kind of that gritty Lucha Underground look, as Michael Cole even talked about his Lucha Underground background. And some of his other wrestling accolades, obviously not talking about his AEW accolades, but a good match overall, and not a good match in the sense of what we saw last week with Monday Night Raw, where it's, like a WrestleMania main event caliber kind of hype, just a good match, a good debut from a luchador and what you can expect watching, WWE television on a weekly basis, hopefully, when it's done right. As for some other segments, right, you saw Jey Uso call out Gunther for what will be the World Heavyweight Championship match at Saturday night's main event. I believe Jey Uso also declared for the Royal Rumble, so, that may be giving away the result for that match. But, a good segment either way, with Gunther essentially talking about how Jey Uso isn't really in his league, and he's more of a main event by name, not main event by actual being in the main event. But a good segment nonetheless to move to that match at Saturday night's main event. And I would say at the start of the show, one thing that I was questioning the most about WWE was the fact that we had Saturday night's main event just about a month ago, and it was quite hyped for a while. And here we go, about a week removed from the next Saturday night's main event, we had nothing for it. But now we have a few things for it. And one other thing we have for it is Sheamus versus Braun Breaker for the Intercontinental Championship, as Sheamus beat Ludwig Kaiser for a pseudo number 1 main event match for that IC belt. So we are going to have that match at Saturday night's main event, and a good kind of segment between Braun Breaker, who was in the crowd, and Sheamus. And I think that's kind of unique. Back-to-back weeks, and including, I think, SmackDown as well, where we have wrestlers in the crowd, not just wrestlers, backstage, or wrestlers coming out to ringside to do guest commentary, to see, like in the number 1 contenders match as we'd see before, somebody coming out and watching the match to see who their next opponent would be, but actually having Braun Breaker like in the crowd as if he bought a ticket to the show. Another segment where we had that same scenario was Bayley, who is a San Jose native, but not on Monday Night Raw. She was essentially in the crowd. And if you have Netflix International with no commercials, you got to see a segment between her and Michael Cole and kind of that fun shtick going on. Obviously, if you don't have the international version, you didn't get to see that. But Nia Jax comes out during Rhea Ripley's promo to not necessarily say she's coming over to Monday Night Raw, but to come out and kind of declare herself for the Royal Rumble and put everyone, Rhea Ripley included, on notice now that she is not the champion over on SmackDown. Bayley did come out, and there was kind of an attack where Rhea Ripley and Bayley teamed up to attack Nia Jax. So, a cool segment and moving again the story there. We don't necessarily know if Nia Jax is coming over to Raw, if her next opponent's going to be Bayley, if she's got her eyes on Rhea Ripley. If she does win the Royal Rumble, does she go after Rhea Ripley? Does she go after Tiffany Stratton? So we don't necessarily know where that goes, but we, again, move the stone along and we move the storyline along. And then, we have some other big segments on the show itself, including probably the biggest segment at the end was the main event, right? Damian Priest, Finn Balor, a street fight. They pulled out all the stops, entertaining from start to finish. It was what you would want in a street fight, even if it was not on pay-per-view, right? This is a pay-per-view caliber match, and it ended up being, pay-per-view quality. Damian Priest gets the win over Finn Balor. I don't necessarily know if that means the end of this long feud between the two of them, but a good main event at the end. And it would be hard for me to miss as well that they crowned the very first ever Women's Intercontinental Champion. At the end of the night, it was Lyra Valkyrie defeating Dakota Kai to become the new WWE Women's Intercontinental Champion. So that was a pretty monumental moment. But overall, the show flowed. Overall, there wasn't really much of a lag, much of a drop-off. We had a New Day segment talking about how they'll be in action next week on Monday Night Raw. Obviously I have the commercial-free version, so, we didn't have to cut away during matches, which was a positive. But overall, the show ended up being exactly what Triple H said in a previous interview recently about his sweet spot in wrestling timing, and that is 2 hours and a half, right? And that's exactly what this show kind of rounded out to be, 2.5 hours. So it wasn't 3 hours, it wasn't 2 hours, it was a perfect 2.5 hours. And that is probably my new favorite thing about WWE being on Netflix is that fluidity. Because as I said before, the problem with 3-hour programming is that fact that some weeks, and most weeks really, you just don't have the stuff for it. And it's lagging and it's pushing and it really just makes it go too long. And you're putting things in there that just bog down the show. So this week, nothing bogged down the show. The show had a good flow to it. We went from match to segment to match to segment. So overall, I thought Raw this week was very good. And yes, I think it's better this week than it was last week. And only for the fact that if this is what we can expect going forward, this being looking like a traditional Raw, looking like the regular setup. And I believe there was some NFL football going on. So it's the fact that this isn't the advertisement for wrestling like it was the week before. This is what it's going to look like if you attend a Monday Night Raw during the time that they're on Netflix. It's going to traditionally look very similar to what Raw looked like before, but maybe with a better flow to it, meaning that they don't have those time constraints, so maybe the show doesn't run as long. They have less wasted segments, more meaningful stuff. And that's probably my favorite part about this, because this is exactly what Raw is hopefully going to look like going forward. This isn't a special presentation. This wasn't a show like the week before where it's main event after main event after main event, with all the celebrities and the Netflix and the TKO people watching and it being talked about on ESPN the next day, right? This is a traditional Monday Night Raw, but without any of the waste and the junk of a 3-hour show where they didn't need to throw something out there. So that's why I'm saying that this week's Monday Night Raw was probably better. And quickly to briefly talk about the ratings. And I recently want to talk about the ratings because of the fact that we talked about it on previous YouTube videos and previous episodes of the podcast. And that was, I don't believe that this is going to be the great renaissance, right? That maybe some other people, and I think Brandon is one of them, might believe it could be. So the ratings came out, and while the ratings are Netflix-style ratings and not Nielsen ratings, and the reason I say that is because recently an interview with someone from Sports Journal said that Nielsen actually works with Netflix, and if WWE wants to work with Nielsen, they can do that to provide accurate, more realistic looking ratings so that they can actually compare Monday Night Raw in the current era to the previous era. So we're not just in the dark, similar to what we are with pay-per-view buys. The pay-per-view buys of the past, it's hard to compare it to now because we have Peacock. So it's hard to really quantify those numbers and to compare WrestleMania 17 to WrestleMania 35 in how many viewers and how many households. But apparently you can do that with Netflix with Nielsen. So I hope they do that going forward. We only have the quote-unquote Netflix ratings to go off of. And the Netflix ratings to go off of saw around 5 million people globally watching Raw. Now, I don't want to talk anything about the global audience because I have no idea what the global audience was prior. So it'd be comparing, apples to nothing, essentially, because 5 million globally means nothing to me. And I don't know how many people globally were watching before. That's such a different thing because not just every country is different, but I don't know necessarily not just where Raw was in the past, but if Raw was even there in the past. I obviously know about certain countries like the UK where you could find a Monday Night Raw, or Canada, or France. Though Monday Night Raw was available for a long time in those places on different channels for sure. But as for places, like India and Japan, I don't know, where Monday Night Raw was prior, in those places and how many people watched them. And the fact that, again, I imagine the majority of people who are watching Monday Night Raw, in Europe and in Asia are doing it the next day due to the time constraints because it's on at 2:00 in the morning. So comparing global, is a difficult thing to do. But they did say that around 2.9 million watched the debut in the United States. And that, if you're comparing it to a Nielsen rating of the past, is a very good Raw. The best watched Raw, in the last half decade or so, absolutely. But is it the most watched Raw of all time? No. Is it even the most watched Raw, going back to 2015? No, it isn't. It wasn't. If you're comparing, ratings in the sense of 2.9 million Netflix watchers to the Nielsen ratings of the past, because there were some Monday Night Raws in the 2000s, and even as early as like 4 years ago, that saw around 3 million people. And that's a big deal because a lot of people were not just touting this as going to be the most watched Monday Night Raw of all time, but some people were even saying that this would be the most watched pro wrestling event of all time, which still to this day stands up to be Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant and that Saturday night's main event, or the main event, back in 1988 that I think saw around 33 million people watch it. Now, just even in comparison of the 90s to now, this is not anywhere near, the most watched wrestling event. And with like some WrestleManias a couple years ago, back in the pay-per-view day, having around, 1 and 1.5 million buys, you can imagine, obviously, there's more than one person in those households making those buys. So just there is around 2 to 3 million people watching those WrestleManias. I think if it is a true 2.9 million and you compare that to the Nielsen ratings of, the millions of people who watch Monday Night Raw, yes, it was a bump from the week before, and it was the most watched Raw of the last couple of years for sure. But to have essentially a WrestleMania card, or, in all intents and purposes, right, a WrestleMania style card, and to have it promoted the way that they did, and to have it presented the way that they did, and to have a rating that is a very, very, very good Raw, but in the history of Monday Night Raw would probably be, maybe like below the top 50. I think that's a little bit disappointing. So it's still difficult to compare those ratings, but if 2.9 million people watched it in the United States, which again, those ratings in the past were also only comparing the United States, I do think that's a little disappointing because, like I said, there is some Monday Night Raws dating back to after and before COVID that got just over 3 million views. And I imagine those are probably pretty good Raws back then, right? But to have a Raw today, to have that Raw, not just any Raw, but that Raw, the Raw with the Tribal Combat match, with the Women's Championship match, with The Rock and Hulk Hogan and all of those people on it, to just have, and again, what were the tickets? Thousands of dollars for ringside, $300 to get in the building itself. I mean, just ultra hyped. As I would say, as hyped as any event in wrestling. It was not the most watched event in professional wrestling history, but definitely one of the most hyped events. So I will say that is a little bit disappointing, and I'm very curious to see what Week 2's ratings are, because I imagine Week 2's ratings probably looked very similar to what we can expect going forward, as well as traditional Raws in the past. I don't know, Netflix, what they would condemn or what they would consider to be successful. We'll have to find out that going forward. But overall, I think Week 2 Monday Night Raw was a better Monday Night Raw for the fact that it presented Raw in the way that we're used to, but in a much better package, better matches, better timing, better flow for the show. So it looked like a Monday Night Raw, but it looked overall to be better.